Tēnā koutou. Katoa. Yeah, my presentation, I don't have the slides there, please. Oh, there we go. It's a bit ambitious for 15 minutes, but we'll try our best. But I want to cover some following themes. What is AUKUS? AUKUS and New Zealand. What is the implications of AUKUS for New Zealand? AUKUS and the perceived China threat. The case for New Zealand's associate membership of AUKUS. What I mean by that is as you're probably aware, there is quite a considerable discussion going on at the moment, and the government's involved in exploratory talks with AUKUS leaders about joining what's called Pillar 2 of AUKUS. More about that in a second, but that would be a sort of partial membership or associate membership of AUKUS. The case for scepticism. Here I sort of review some of the arguments made for why New Zealand should join, and I do it in a critical fashion. And then some concluding comments about why I think the evidence suggests that AUKUS is a potentially high-risk strategy for New Zealand. So that's our agenda. I think it's always very important in international relations to be very clear-eyed about strategy. What is strategy? It's about the relationship between means and ends. And my sense, on the evidence presented so far, that the trilateral security partnership, known as AUKUS, is not likely to live up to expectations in strategic terms. And I think New Zealand, for the moment, should be wary of getting involved in the Security Pact. So what is AUKUS? And very briefly, it's a trilateral security pact, which was, typo there, which was signed in September 2021, which involves Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. When it was set up, when it was signed in September 2021, it was rationalised, quote, as a shared commitment to the international rules-based order amongst the three members, and in particular to uphold the international rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region. China was not identified explicitly, but it was quite implicit that China, and in fact New Zealand's own Defence Ministry, issued a statement in 2018 identifying China as a threat to the international rules-based order in which New Zealand, amongst other countries, depends quite critically. It was also designed to promote stability and prosperity, according to the three members of AUKUS, in a dynamic region which contains about 60% of the world's population. And you can understand why there's such an interest in the Indo-Pacific, because the Indo-Pacific is rapidly replacing what used to be the transatlantic area as the central engine of global growth. It's the centerpiece of the global economy, and it's coming into sharp focus. What does AUKUS entail? Two major initiatives. The first one was confirmed in March 2023, in which Australia would buy at least 3 Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines by the early 2030s and receive 5 or more brand new SSN AUKUS submarines, which combine US technology and a UK design by the 2050s. I haven't put the costs of this, but the costs will be for Australia, between 268 billion and 358 billion. It's according to Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, is the biggest single investment in security by any Australian government in the post-45 period. In addition, and that's, if you like, one dimension, the Pillar 1, Australia receiving nuclear-powered submarines. Dimension 2, or Pillar 2, AUKUS envisages the sharing of information in cutting-edge defence technologies, including artificial intelligence, quantum capabilities, and cyber security. AUKUS and New Zealand. It was not surprising, given that we have a non-nuclear security policy, that we were initially not invited to join AUKUS, but we now know that the Chris Hipkins-led Labour government is, as I said before, engaged in exploratory discussions about possibly becoming a Pillar 2 member of AUKUS, to sort of be a non-nuclear member of AUKUS, if that's possible, so that Wellington could access state-of-the-art defence technologies. Let's just talk a little bit about the AUKUS and the perceived China threat. Since 2012, Chinese foreign policy appears, and there's nothing controversial about this, to become much more assertive and much more belligerent. But amongst other things, Beijing has bolstered its claims to 90% of the disputed South China Sea, firmly rejected a 2016 ruling by the Hague Court of Arbitration in a case brought by the Philippines that Chinese claims to the South China Sea lack foundation. And it's done a variety of other things that I think has unnerved actors in the Indo-Pacific. China has condemned Australia for questioning China's handling the COVID-19 pandemic. It stepped up patrols around Japanese Senkaku Islands, clashed with India in the Himalayas, and obviously we've seen China stepping up pressure around Taiwan. It's cracked down on the once partly autonomous region of Hong Kong and remained neutral over the Ukraine. And that's, of course, very significant because you couldn't get a more blatant breach of international rules than the Russians have engaged in going into the Ukraine. I mean, it's basically ripped up the UN Charter, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the fact the Chinese have been ambivalent on the principles of territorial integrity and state sovereignty is extraordinary. But, as Al mentioned yesterday in his excellent presentation, China is not the only threat to the international rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. Amongst other things, we've seen the democratic elected government in Myanmar overthrown by the military, and we're now witnessing Beijing and Russia providing military and economic assistance as the brutal military dictatorship there cracks down against domestic dissent. Not surprisingly, China, which must perceive it's the target of AUKUS, has expressed its strong opposition to AUKUS. It said, amongst other things, that the nuclear submarine deal reflected a Cold War mentality and constituted a threat to both regional peace and the international nuclear proliferation regime. And by the way, legally, and the lawyers amongst you can correct me, I do think AUKUS is on shaky ground, transferring nuclear technology to Australia. It does seem to test the limits of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So what is the case for New Zealand being part of this arrangement? Advocates argue, and there's no shortage of them actually, that New Zealand runs the risk of being strategically sidelined if we do not join AUKUS as an associate member. They claim that a new Cold War is underway between the United States and China, and that Wellington's preferred option of hedging has been squeezed to a point where it's no longer viable. In this context, it's argued New Zealand simply must get off the fence and choose a side to align with, and given its existing political and security ties with Australia, the UK and the US, it makes sense, the advocates argue, for New Zealand to align itself with AUKUS. It's further argued that such an alignment would not jeopardise New Zealand's non-nuclear security policy. And that, in fact, that point is being repeated by Andrew Little, the Defence Minister. But we can take that up in discussion. But the other point that the advocates made is that failure to join AUKUS could mean that New Zealand will not be able to access the advanced technologies it needs militarily in the Indo-Pacific region. So this is a big point of emphasis. We will be left behind if we are not part of AUKUS. The case for scepticism. How am I doing for time, Al? 5, good. Firstly, and most obviously, the Cold War analogy is fundamentally inaccurate. I'm appalled by the number of people who keep saying we're entering a new Cold War. It's inaccurate because there is truly one global economy now, of which China is an enthusiastic member. It's a member of the world capitalist economy. And secondly, there is no comparable bifurcation of the international system as there was during the Cold War, in which there were competing but comparable alliances. It's a completely different era. The binary assumption that the future of the Indo-Pacific will be determined by US-China remains very problematic. And that takes me to another point. Regional actors like Malaysia, and these are significant actors, like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, these countries have considerable potential and in some cases dynamic economies. And EU states like France and Germany, which have considerable interest in the Indo-Pacific region, they actually have very little confidence that 3 or possibly 4 English-speaking states offer a serious counterweight to China in a region inhabited by billions of people. In other words, this tight alliance, as it is currently constituted, there seems to be a mismatch between the problem. China is too big to contain, as President Obama noted many years ago, and has extensive trading links with many countries. So there has to be a question mark about whether this counterweight is credible. Make no mistake, China has global ambitions. We should have no illusions about that. But they should not be overhyped. China has vulnerabilities. China is reliant on the global market economy. Its 2 biggest export markets remain the United States and the EU. Over $1,400 billion worth of Chinese exports went to those 2 markets alone last year. And this is a point that's often, I think, de-emphasized in the United States, its one-party state is a deeply unattractive political model to many countries in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. That's a huge handicap for a would-be superpower that needs friends. Yes, countries are happy to do business with China, but that doesn't mean they're going to adopt their ideas about how they organize society. New Zealand's participation in AUKUS would raise real uncertainties in the Indo-Pacific about New Zealand's independent foreign policy. And the credibility of Wellington's non-nuclear security commitment in a region where AUKUS has been criticised for fueling nuclear proliferation, this is really a serious tension. It doesn't matter what we say that this is not a threat to what New Zealand is doing is not fueling nuclear proliferation. The perception in ASEAN and the Pacific Island states is that AUKUS is a trigger for nuclear proliferation. The other thing that we should take issue with, the idea that New Zealand will be left behind that if it's not a member of AUKUS. New Zealand has a partner relationship with NATO. It's a member of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement, and also it has excellent bilateral relations with Australia and the United States. It's not in the interest of any of those countries or entities to deprive New Zealand of any technology. And the 3 members of AUKUS do not have a monopoly on that cutting-edge defence technology. So I've skipped to the conclusion because I realise I'm fighting time and I've got 1 minute, so. On balance, I think detachment from AUKUS seems a much less risky option at this time for New Zealand than one of partial membership. It would minimise the prospect of reputational damage to New Zealand's non-nuclear security policy. We've established a lot of credibility internationally as being a champion of the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. We were a leading player in that. We also are signatories to the Treaty of Rarotonga, creating a nuclear-free zone in the South Pacific. And all ASEAN countries have signed up to the nuclear weapon-free zone in their region, Southeast Asia. So there's quite a lot at stake here, and I think it is something we need to think about very carefully. The other crucial thing is, and this is a core strategic objective, we have, as a diplomatic selling point, always distinguished ourselves from Australia as not being as close to the United States as Australia is, as having the capacity to make independent decisions, whether it be over non-nuclear security policy or whether it be over opposing the US illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. We run the risk of eroding the perception that we're capable of taking independent decisions if we simply fall into lockstep over AUKUS on what seem to be less than convincing grounds. I've got some other points there, but I'm running short of time. An hour's given me the hard look, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.